a blood testing company that very, very high profile, just a stellar board, members of Congress, cabinet members, just a who's who, very accomplished and smart people. But nobody really asked, does the product work? Healthcare claim processors recently had cyber attack, a breach, 120 patient records involved, $3 billion in damages.
Wow.
And it was all because the access to the portal was compromised. Asking questions like, do we have MFA, multi-factor authentication? People equate presence with governance on board. It's much more than that.
Is it the CEO's fault that these boards fail, or is it the board's fault?
Everybody has the best intentions in mind.
It's almost like they're set up to fail, right? The board meeting is set up to fail. The CEO is set up to fail.
We've all been guilty of it or have been victims of it, getting the board packet 24 hours before the board meeting. And the agenda is just emails with bullet points.
Boards fail, CEOs fail. Are boards ever perfect?
There's no such thing as a perfect board because...
Well, welcome to the Boardroom Company Live. I'm Naomi Kent, and today we're going to be talking about why do boards fail? Why do boards fail? And with me to discuss this very interesting topic is Israel Rollins. Israel, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So, Israel, you're the founder of a brand new governance solution for private companies called Boardkit.
Yes.
And you bring a pretty unusual background with you, which is you've been and I've got it here, registered clinical pharmacist, medical device CEO. You're currently a managing partner of Aligned Health Ventures, and you're also involved in an early stage healthcare AI fund as well. So, you've been doing a lot of things, and now you've built Boardkit, which is hopefully there to prevent boards from failing. Is that right?
Indeed. Really didn't set out just to build a product, but a solution to a problem I've been seeing time and time again. And I think I can kind of go back to the origin story. Thanks for having me here in lovely Pine Hills Park, Florida. And St. Pete, Florida is where I'm from, right down the street. So Florida boy, born and raised and schooled here at Florida A&M, studied pharmacy and went off and got my MBA. But I think my first interaction with board and board failure happened after my first job. That's when I was recruited to come to Nashville, Tennessee, where I reside right now, and work for HCA. And I was in the investor relations area. About 6 months into my tenure, the company was hit with a Medicaid fraud claim by the federal government. And I know we can talk a little bit about that later, but one of the things that I saw going through that problem, going through that turmoil, was the need for good governance. And ever since then, I've been seeing a pattern emerge from big companies, publicly listed, to private companies, that there isn't a system to really hold management accountable and to make sure that, and again, none of these situations that we'll talk about a little bit later were out of malice, but just not having the right system in place.
And so, talk to us a little bit. You talked about fraud just a minute ago, which is obviously, I think that's a pretty scary thing for a lot of companies, especially when it happens at the top. But, what mistakes do boards or companies generally make that you're trying to, help avoid?
Yeah, I think part of it is that people equate presence with governance on board. It's much more than that. It's asking the tough questions, being inquisitive and being curious about what is going on with the company, and recognizing the fiduciary responsibility that you have as a seated board director. So I think, again, that's kind of the patterns that I've been seeing, and we could touch on a couple of the other failures that I used to develop Boardkit, and it's really based upon real world evidence of boards not doing exactly what they need to be doing, not out of malice, but just not having the right system in place.
So you're sort of saying that boards don't really have the right rules and regulations, especially private companies, right? There's a difference between a publicly traded company and a private company. Talk to us about that. Why do you think the private companies need this more?
Yeah, I think when you look at publicly traded companies, they have the scrutiny of the capital markets. They have Sarbanes-Oxley and Reg FD, all of these disclosures that are pointed to informing the public about what's going on with the company. Private companies just don't have that. Basically, what they have is the conscience of those individuals in the board seats that are pretty much directing the governance structure and how governance is approached in that particular company. So again, with private companies, you just don't have that. But with public companies, you really do have the scrutiny of SEC and the capital markets themselves to really keep boards honest and keep companies honest.
A lot of private companies, it sort of runs the gamut, right? You can get private companies that are very buttoned up, that have everything. Their board meetings are run very much like a publicly traded company with the rules and regulations. And then there are others where it's non-existent, right?
Yeah.
What has been your experience? What have you seen?
Well, as you mentioned, I'm an early stage venture capitalist. I invest in seed stage companies where a lot of times the boards are just three people, the two co-founders and friends and family, the first check-in. That is a completely different structure than a private equity backed company that's getting ready for a trade sale or even going public. So I think what we see is pretty much the gamut. You see a board that is, again, structured for the earliest stages of a company to one that is really getting ready to be publicly scrutinized and to be, ready for that next level of financing.
You mentioned moment ago the founder, which I'm sure in a lot of your VC backed or even privately held companies, the CEO is doing a lot of the lead, right, when it comes to the company.
Yes.
Is it the CEO's fault that these boards fail, or is it the board's fault? Where do you see the real problem starting or occurring?
I don't know. Let's reframe that. I think it's best to say why they fail. And I think, again, everybody has the best intentions in mind. But I think that without the right system and recognizing that before, during, and after the meeting, and even between the quarterly board meetings, there needs to be accountability, there needs to be structure in place to make sure that the commitments are being kept, that the questions that needs to be asked are being asked and answered, and that there should be some form of tracking mechanism to make sure all of these things are being accomplished.
You talked about structure, accountability. Again, Boardkit is kind of bringing in that structure
Mhm.
and helping to create that accountability. Are you seeing sort of from one meeting to the next, things are sort of not like, and I've seen this with boards as well, hey, we were talking about this big deal that's going to come in.
Yeah.
And the next meeting, no one's talking about it. Where did that go? Right. Oh,
Yeah.
well, we lost it. Okay. Well, we need to know. Right. So there needs to be a conversation. So without a plan and without a guide, I think a lot of these boards, it's sort of falling by the wayside. It's nobody's responsibility. Would you agree with that? And that's why Boardkit is helpful, right,
Oh,
in these
well,
instances?
absolutely. You need that connective tissue, if you will, between those meetings. A lot of times, board members are taking notes. You have maybe a secretary or somebody who's there, corporate secretary, who's there that is codifying what's being said, and minutes are captured. But in terms of things that needs to be followed up, who is it assigned to? When is it expected to be done? And what does the outcome look like? That's one of the things that I've seen in companies, private companies, big and small, that they don't have that mechanism to make sure that there's a resolution to whatever was brought up in that previous meeting, and making sure that that person who that task was assigned to really accomplishes what they needed to do.
There's been a lot of conversation, at least I'm having with my clients, and a lot of them are applying for board seats or they're being proposed, right? You should apply for this particular board seat. And a whole conversation about skills matrix comes up, right? And do we have the right fit? And often they are or they are not the right fit, right? Depending on who else is on the board. Is that something you see a lot of these private companies doing, or is it just sort of friends, family, and then the VC, and then somebody I like, right, that gives me good advice? How do they build boards?
Yeah.
Is it done in the right way?
Yeah. I think at the various stages, especially with early stage companies, the board is pretty much consisted of people that the CEO or founder trusts. And these are individuals that will pretty much codify a lot of the things that the CEO would or founder would be bringing up. However, I think that as companies grow and as they mature, there's the role for an independent board director that has an outside lens, that has an inquisitive nature about them, to ask the questions that may not be asked by that original board of kind of friends and trusted circles. So, yeah, again, I think it really depends on the stage. But I think if we wire these companies at the very onset to really think through what are the skills that we need here at seed stage, at Series A stage, and as the company goes through its growth and maturation, and even start looking at acquisitions, what type of skill set do we need in these seats? And I think that skills matrix is one of the tools that can really help identify those gaps and help the board, the nomination and governance committee, think through who we can seat in that seat, and and fill those gaps that the company needs in terms of good governance.
I think another reason why boards may fail, we touched on it a moment ago, is what actually happens in the meeting, right?
Mm.
Who presents, what is presented, what are the questions that should be asked? What do you think needs to happen to improve the actual meeting itself to ensure that boards do not fail?
I'm glad you asked because that's kind of the DNA, the line that goes through all of
Okay.
the templates in Boardkit. So we built Boardkit, 9 templates that cover the gamut of the board life cycle, if you will, from prior preparation to conducting the meeting itself, post meeting follow up, and all the things that happen in between. And one of the things that I think is really key to ensuring that this board is effective and works well is a measurement system, a performance evaluation system that not only tracks how well these individual board directors are performing, but how is the actual board itself performing as a whole. So I'm an operator, co-founded a population health management company some time ago, and one of the things that I learned is what doesn't get measured doesn't get managed. And I think that's true of not only at the company side, but also at the board side as well. Another thing that I think is happening in a lot of these board meetings. So I mentioned I'm a venture capitalist, and I was not only the CEO of a med device company, was on that board. What I found, and actually was kind of guilty of as well, was that I was presenting a lot of the lagging indicators, like the historic financials or KPIs, versus really what is forward looking and what do we really need to start thinking through in terms of the direction that the company is going in.
So you were sort of looking into the past
In the past,
versus
you can't
worrying
drive a car looking
about
in
the
the
future.
rearview mirror. You
Yeah.
got to
Yeah.
look into the future. And I think an effective board will be asking those questions. And an effective and prepared CEO who is conducting the meeting would have those KPIs or those indicators that are looking forward, those forward-looking indicators.
One of the things I think I hear a lot from CEOs is they say, boy, we got the board meeting next week. There's an eye roll. Oh, we got to do all the documents for the board meeting. It takes up a lot of time, and I feel like there's a lot of energy put into it. And no one sort of has there's no guide, right? So it's almost, in some cases, the board meeting is a little bit of just throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks each time. Is that also a problem that you're trying to solve to help take some of that sort of energy and time away from the CEO having to think up, what am I going to plan for this board meeting and how is it going to be run? Is that also
Oh,
part of it?
absolutely. And I think what it does, it takes boards that are performative, that are showing up, to being actually active boards and boards that are involved. When we think about it, the board is actually probably the most consequential room or meeting in that particular company. In developing Boardkit, I looked at some real world failures, starting with, my own at this healthcare company that at the time was the largest fine for Medicare fraud and restructuring that happened right after that. I saw firsthand a board being reconstituted. I saw firsthand 9 out of the top 12 officers, being removed as a consequence of this. I think, with something like Boardkit, it allows those CEOs and those boards to plan ahead and to focus their energy on things that will help the board ask the right questions, be curious about the questions. No, yeah, by the way, in each of my templates, I've embedded some questions that board members should be asking. And I mentioned earlier that I did some real world evaluation and research. I looked at a couple of failures that are very, very high profile. I'm not going to name the companies, but you probably can think about them. And a blood testing company that very, very high profile, just a stellar board, members of Congress, cabinet members, just the who's who, very accomplished and smart people. But nobody really asked, does the product work? And can you prove it? Again, these are the questions that I think board directors should be asking to make sure that not only is a functioning and strong board, but the company is going and moving in the right direction. And even there's a kind of a co-working company that I researched that the CEO was self-dealing. And all the while, the board was just applauding because of the spectacular growth of that company. But it wound up being destroying a lot of value for investors as well as the public in general. So, again, I think tools that allow board directors as well as CEOs to prepare to be efficient at what they do. And in fact, there was another module or template that I use. It's around the consent agenda. And the consent agenda is really the routine voting things that boards do on a quarterly basis. Why not package all that up and do that beforehand and just use one vote? And that way you can free up the board agenda to be more strategic, to be more thoughtful, to be more open for more discussion instead of rushing around trying to squeeze in time to do that. So just practical things that I think, boards again should be doing. And don't get me wrong, I know a lot of boards are doing all of these things, doing the right things. I know directors are doing the right things. Their CEOs are doing the right thing. But I think this is probably the first product, if you will, that really ties it all together and just really simplifies that and codifies that for all those involved.
I like your comment about, people are not, they're not bad people. They're not bad business people either.
No.
It's almost like they're set up to fail, right? The board meeting is set up to fail. The CEO is set up to fail because they don't have the time to put in all the work. They don't know what questions they should be asked, or they don't, the whole meeting is run poorly, essentially, right? So just getting some, and I don't know if it's the word governance sounds sort of very heavy, right? It's more, for me, it's more efficiency. It's more about getting the most out of people,
Yeah.
right? In the time that you have with them, because it's not a lot of time, right? Um, you know, uh, assessments, you talked about it a minute ago, and sort of I know there's a lot of self-assessments that happen for board members, and then chairs can assess individuals. How have you considered that in improving the way board meetings are run and the way board members are more effective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, going back to the adage, what doesn't get measured doesn't get managed. And there's always room for improvement. I think that for sitting board directors, the skill sets that, they bring to the table, the unique viewpoints that they bring to the table is definitely valuable. But we want to make sure that it's done in an effective manner that is indeed moving the company forward. And I think there's one thing that is probably not captured in some of these evaluations is just the natural curiosity that I think these board members have. I did a Medium piece a little while back, and it was around, and I'm dating myself, a TV show I saw as a kid growing up called Columbo. Peter Falk played
I remember
this
Columbo.
role. But the thing with Columbo was, he shows up, he's frumpled.
You have a cigar, like always.
Oh
Yeah, I
my
was always
gosh.
smoking a cigar. Yeah.
And just, and then, had his cards and notebooks. And that was basically his moving office, if you will. But I think with Columbo, his inclination around being intellectually curious, asking, and his catchphrase was just one more thing, asking the question that should be obvious to everybody, but nobody had asked. It was his way of really unlocking what was going on. And after that question was asked, the case broke wide open. And I think all of us could be a little Columbo in our board seats to ask those questions that we thought were obvious or already answered. In fact, in researching, developing the product, I came across a very, very famous, high-profile consumer brand that recently it was disclosed they haven't filed taxes since 2018.
Wow.
I don't know how that happened. Well, yeah, I do know how that happens. Nobody in the board seat asked the question, are we complying with all regulations? Have all taxes been filed? And if there's any fees or penalties, have they been paid?
I think you can just look it up. I mean, it's probably public information if you
But
needed
this
to,
should
right?
be
Yeah,
disclosed.
they didn't. Yeah, true.
And so, again, this puts the company at peril. So, again, you said the word governance is heavy. It is. And hopefully, a tool like Boardkit is for those individuals and those boards that really takes the job very, very seriously. And as I said, I think the boardroom is probably the most consequential room in the entire company.
I want to just touch on a few things. Publicly traded companies have a lot of regulation, age limits, term limits. They don't always have to abide by them, but there are some rules and things like that. Do you think it's valuable for private companies to do those things too? Where do you see the value in that?
Oh, absolutely. As I mentioned, my first job was in investor relations at a very, very large publicly traded company. And we eventually settled with the government, spun off a bunch of non-core assets and that I was involved with. And we got into a corporate integrity agreement where part of it was creating the controls that are needed from an accounting standpoint, billing standpoint, physician relations standpoint, plus an ethics and compliance program that made sure that things like this doesn't happen again, that there's a whistleblower, if you will, mechanism. I think why not encode that in the DNA of these small companies already? I think many, many companies have the desire to grow and to be substantial, members of society and contributing to their shareholders and returning capital to their shareholders. But I think if we start that and almost look like these publicly traded companies at the very earliest stages. Now, of course, I mentioned the startup that has, maybe 3 members on the board. Of course, you can't have, Sarbanes-Oxley level, filing 8Ks
Right.
and all of that. I think the main thing is that we're not doing that right now. but one day we need to be building towards that. And we need to codify all of the activities of the board. We need to make sure that we're keeping track of the work that we're doing. And even simple things like KPIs. I talked about forward-looking indicators and lagging indicators. Even in some companies, KPIs mean one thing to the CFO and mean something else to the sales rep, the head of sales. So even things like that, that I think could be in a larger company, in a publicly traded company, is already, kind of set. In these smaller companies, I think that, we need to start, using tools like that and asking the questions, making sure that we're comparing apples to apples. And in fact, I'm kind of, eating our own dog food, if you will. As I mentioned, I'm a VC. I run Alliant Health Ventures. It's a early stage, seed stage VC, and we've been in business for about 2, 3 years and made 3 investments so far. And Boardkit is part of the welcoming package for those companies, and it's been well received.
Let's talk a little bit about leadership succession. I know for a lot of these early stage or even privately held companies, family owned businesses, leadership succession can be a sore topic, or it can be a topic that, big elephant in the room type situation where you're talking, maybe you've got a founder, right? Or a family member, and you have to have some hard conversations. How, how have you solved for that? Because I know there are a lot of businesses, and actually I was talking to somebody recently and they said, oh, we've got a founder-led company. And the founder came to us and actually said, listen, I don't think I'm the CEO for this next stage of the company. And everyone's sort of like, wow, we didn't think he'd actually say that, but he did. But I don't think that's the norm. I think a lot of founder CEOs will want to be there to the end, and they don't want to break away, and they don't want to give up, right, their leadership to somebody else, even if they're perhaps not the right fit. So how have you solved for that? What have you seen work in those situations where you get the best people running the company?
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think it's not only, venture-backed companies, PE-backed companies, public companies for that matter, even nonprofits have issues or situations where they have to deal with CEO succession and planning. And I always say the best time to work on those plans is when you don't need it, and to get out ahead of that. Because once that CEO leaves, it's a huge disruption. And I think everybody underestimates how big of a disruption that is to the day to day operation, whether it's a planned departure or even in some cases, very high profile, immediate departure for whatever reason. So I think having a mechanism in place that, again, where you're evaluating the CEO, there's constant conversation between the CEO and the board, full disclosure, full confidence, and trustworthy conversations, which again I think is the key to having a good board CEO relationship. And I think with different tools that are out there, of course, Boardkit isn't the only one that has it, but it ties into the entire board cycle. But I think when we're looking, again, I'm using the lens of a venture capitalist. The founder, technical founder, most of the time, especially with software or technology type of ventures, may not be the CEO when it comes for a later round or a growth round or a sale to maybe a large, trade sale to a strategic, or even if they're lucky enough to go IPO. So I think again that succession planning piece is key, is germane. Again, it is part of that board responsibility to make sure that that right person is in the right seat at the right time for the right moment.
So it sounds like you kind of have to force the conversation, right? You have
It's
to.
hard. It's
It
tough.
has to be like this is a rule. We talk about this once a year, or whatever the time frame is. Um, so boards fail, CEOs fail. Are boards ever perfect? Like, what have you seen? Have you seen a perfect board? What does it look like?
I would run if somebody because there's no such thing as a perfect board because there's always room for improvement, and there's always an ever moving, I guess, slate of directors. I think the main thing is, and I know people bring up the topic of age limit, term limit. It's all academic, but I think the main thing is that you have inquisitive board members. I don't care if it's a 72-year-old person, if they're incredibly astute, asking the right questions, the Columbo questions, if you will, versus a 45-year-old who's just there and invisible and sinking into the furniture. What does that do for the company? There's an adage in governance called "nose in, fingers out," and it's you know I really just kind of recently came into it, and as an operator, I'm fingers in, but a good board director, regardless of age or regardless of term limit, the time that they're spending in that seat, they have to have a disposition where they're curious enough to ask the right questions, to not be satisfied with the surface or perfunctory type of answer, but to get to the real core of the matter, recognizing their fiduciary responsibility, but also to to ensure that they're not micromanaging. Um, Again, you asked if there are any, the best boards. It runs the gamut. It is, from companies that have boards that don't ask any questions, they rubber stamp, to a board where they micromanage. They're actually having their hands in the day-to-day operations. So, I don't think there is a, perfect board, but I think there's a sweet spot in the middle where board directors can have their nose in, inquisitive enough, but have the resolve to not get their hands involved in the day to day.
Now, I know a lot of people who are listening to this podcast, they're either aspiring board members or they're current board members of all types of companies. And I'm sure they've heard a little bit of a shocking answer for they're not perfect, right? So how do we know if we are good board directors? What are some of the signs that you've seen that could indicate that if I'm on a board or you're on a board, we're all on boards here, but are we doing a good job? How do we know?
Yeah, I think for people going into a board for the first time, there's you know, a lot of times in boards that I've been involved in, you get the bylaws, you get a DNO policy and you get the agenda. Good luck. And I think the best practice is basically onboarding those board members to get involved with the CEO, CFO, head of operations, and other members of the board, and even getting a mentor on the board. I think that's one piece of it, but the self evaluation piece, I would think, just having a very very tough conversation with yourself, asking, what is my unique contribution? What is the perspective that I'm bringing to the table that no one else on this board has? Um, how prepared am I, for this particular seat? How prepared will I be before the meetings? And again, you know, a lot of times we've all been guilty of it or have been victims of it, of getting the board packet like 24 hours before the board meeting, and the agenda is just emails with bullet points. But again, with, templates like Boardkit that, ensures that all of this gets out ahead of time, that, of course, it's not preparing the board packet, but preparing the board members to be able to go through the board packet and being well prepared. So again, I think the other question is, as a board director, how much time can I give and devote to being prepared and being ready to ask the right questions, the probative questions, the questions that will surface things that will help the company move forward. Like case in point, the tax filings. I mean, you think it's a foregone conclusion, but just asking questions like that and being prepared is I think one of the things that I think is germane to that. And then again, I think, and I encourage all of your listeners to be like Columbo and just ask the uncomfortable question, and not just to be antagonistic, but the things that aren't surface will compound over time and may cause these companies to eventually to blow up. And case in point, one of the largest healthcare claim processors recently had a cyber attack, a breach, 120 patient records involved, 120 million patients. Their records were exposed. $3 billion in
Wow.
damages. Yeah. And it was all because of a portal, and the access to the portal was compromised. Asking questions like, do we have MFA, multi-factor authentication for all of our surfaces with vendors, with patients, with other people on our team? Just asking those questions. So yeah, I think hopefully that answer the
Yeah.
question.
No, that's very helpful. Um, let's talk a little bit about committees. Some private companies have them, others don't. Do you see those being run well? Like, do they fail? Where do they fail, or where do they fall down?
Yeah, I think, these committees, again, it's about being prepared and knowing where and what areas of governance that they're responsible for. We have, three standing committees, in most large company, Nom and Gov and Audit and Comp. And I think that, again, knowing where their responsibilities begin and end and how that fits into the much larger board picture and being prepared. You can use pretty much the same tools and approach. Make sure that you get the information to the board members, the committee members well ahead of time. And anything that needs to be surfaced to the larger board, we make sure that those are surfaced. And also, executive committee is a very powerful tool to be able to, ask and surface the question without the presence of management. So again, it's about being efficient with time. It's about being prepared, and again, just asking the right questions.
Now, I know I had a little look at some of the templates that you have, which are sort of, again, the guide for how to run a board meeting. And there was a section, I didn't go into in a lot of detail, but there were sections that were separated by industry. And I found that quite interesting that you had done that. Why do certain industries have to have a specific set of rules, and how are they different from others? And can you give us some examples of why their board meetings might be a little different?
Well, I'm a little bit biased. I'm a healthcare executive pharmacist, and I focus on investing in healthcare. And healthcare has a ton of regulations. And I think by focusing on understanding, of course, your board composition should be, pretty knowledgeable about that area. Maybe not experts, but at least knowledgeable enough to ask the right questions. Um, I did a section in Fintech, which, again, another highly regulated industry. And in fact, another one of the examples that I used that I researched was a cryptocurrency exchange that tens of billions of dollars was just going from one ledger to another without anybody asking the question, like, where's the money? Like, right now, can you
It's
produce?
disappeared.
Yeah, can you give us a financial statement on and accountability on where the money is right now? I'll give you 48 hours. Go. And, even with nonprofits, there's questions around the donors and restricted versus non-restricted types of grants, and making sure that those things are tracking according to the spirit in which those grants were given. So again, different industries, different surface areas that needs to be addressed. But I think, at the same time, again, making sure that there's a systematic way, an operating system, if you will, to be able to address the needs of those specific industries.
And another thing that I hear a lot about, and actually I've been through it in some boards I've been on, is the ability to scenario plan, right? And sort of foresee a problem that may happen in the business and then kind of run through what would we do as a business, right?
Yeah.
Well, what was the first step and the second step? Who calls whom? What happens, right? And I know that you've sort of built in a kind of scenario planning piece to some of the recommendations that you have in the form of case studies. Is that right? Like, are they working to be sort of helping people kind of understand what would the business do, if a certain crisis came up, right?
Yeah, I think I do it two ways. And you're talking about the pro tier, which is it's the core product, but also the more in-depth industry specific and adding some pieces along AI and cybersecurity. So what the scenario planning does is make the abstract real and visceral. You can look at templates, you can, you know, talk about things, but if you have a real life case study that you can walk through and put yourself in the shoes of those antagonists and protagonists that are in those situations, I think it really brings a lot of those governance issues to light. I also included in Boardkit in kind of a tabletop exercise. And I know there's a lot of consulting firms and executive coaches, board coaches that do that as well. And I think it's very, very important for folks to really understand that some things happen, they escalate, they don't stay stagnant. And in fact, in Boardkit, I think I have like 5 different scenarios. One of them is an emergency CEO, succession. Another is a cybersecurity type of breach. I gotta give a shout out to the NACD, National Association of Corporate Directors. And I sat and secured the directorship certification. And part of the examination are case studies. And the case studies are pretty notorious for kind of trapping individuals who are taking those exams because again, the adage of nose in, fingers out, these scenarios in these tabletop exercises are just that to help board members really realize and think through. I'm a board director. This is the information that I'm getting from the CFO or the CISO or from the CEO. How can I, in my seat, without jumping in and trying to repair everything myself, how can I ask the right questions? And of course, with more than real life, you'll have these things kind of escalating and sometimes snowball.
I'm sure.
So, yeah, I think those things are important to bring things that are abstract to life.
Yeah, and I think the practice is good. There's one other thing before we start to wrap up here is what, you know, I think a lot of first-time board members worry about what questions they should be asking. We've talked a lot about this in this interview, which is, you know, at this position, in this particular scenario, you should be asking the right questions. Noses in, fingers out. You should be asking the right questions. But what questions should we be asking, right? Do you have some? Do you recommend some, or what are your thoughts on that?
And kind of going back to the examples that I used to build Boardkit. You does the product work? You know, have all the taxes been filed or any regulatory issues? Asking management, is there any bad news we should be, expecting? Where's the money right now? And then also asking more forward looking questions versus kind of just looking in the rearview mirror and those lagging indicators that shows where the company has been. But again, as board directors, we want to make sure that we're looking to the future and where the company is going. So I think board directors coming into those roles should be asking questions around those particular couple of topics I just laid out.
Okay, so let's say we're just about to join a board. Anybody here listening is just about to join a board in the next 6 months. They don't want to fail, right? So, what advice would you give someone who's going to be joining a board pretty soon? What advice would you give them?
I would ask for an onboarding, a plan where 60, 90 days to be able to sit down with the lead or the chair of the board to get a feel for how the board functions and also how the company functions. Because again, these are two distinct functions, two distinct groups of individuals with two distinct roles. And I would also want to make sure that I get all of the information that I need to be informed. That includes, we talked about lagging indicators. Here. We do need financial statements, right? We do need product plans and strategy. We do need to understand from a human capital standpoint where we are and where some of the gaps are from a company standpoint. So to go into these seats as informed as possible is probably the kind of the best recommendation that I would have for potential board members or those who are getting ready for their first seat at the table. And then I also mentioned, I think earlier on, know your own unique contribution. What is it? Because you were brought to that board for a particular reason, for your perspective, your experience, your skill set. Think about that and don't be afraid to use your voice to surface those questions that, again, a lot of people believe that are already being asked, and a lot of times they're not.
Well, Israel, I take my role as podcast host here very seriously, just like Columbo. So I am going to ask you, is there anything else that we should be talking about here today?
Just one more question.
Just one more I want to give you.
So from what I described of Boardkit, how do you think that your audience will receive something like this? Would they think that, oh, we've got this. This is, just one more thing to add to my busy to-do list. Do you think they'll really take this seriously? Because again, my role as a VC, and I don't think we touched on this, is that I'm a dual fiduciary. I have a responsibility to my investors. I have to be a good steward of their money, but I also have a responsibility to the company. So again, it's this dual role, and I don't know how many of your audience members or people in your network that are there, but I wonder, do they think that something like like Boardkit, will be a helpful toolkit to help them be successful in their role?
Well, I think personally, the way that I would look at it is, it's like anything. If you're walking into something that is as complex and complicated as a board meeting, right? Better to have some guidance and some rules around what you're doing
Mhm.
from an expert who's obviously done that. It's a little bit like saying I'm going to the gym, but if you have a plan of what you're going to do in the gym, you'll probably have a better workout and a better time, and you don't even have to think about it.
Yeah.
So I think it takes away from the need for board members to be governance experts, which I don't think they are all the time. I think they're great at their skill. I think they have great skills. I think they have experience. Some of them are industry experts, right? But they don't necessarily come with, oh, I'm a governance expert. I know exactly how to run a board meeting. And here's another thing I've found is that even really experienced board members will tell you that every board meeting is run a little differently, right? And some are effective and some are not. And I would probably say on the private company front, it probably leads more more toward than they are not. And so I think that having a guide, right, of how you can run your board meeting, in my opinion, not necessarily saying we're not running our board meetings properly, but actually saying, why don't we just take the weight off everybody having to do this and, take the guide, right? Again, going to the gym and having the trainer tell you, here are the things that you should be doing in order to get fit. So that would be my sort of thought, is that it's just one thing that they don't have to worry about. And the outcomes could be potentially really positive based on what we've talked about. CEOs, the board coming in to do the work versus coming in to actually run the board meeting, right, and take over. The CEO not having to do that work either, and they can focus more on the business. So I think there's a lot of benefits there and a lot of reasons why just having a guide. And I know in some of the board meetings I've been in, I would have appreciated it. So, yeah.
Very good. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Right. Well, listen, thanks for your time here in St. Petersburg, Florida. Next up, I'll be in St. Louis, Missouri. So that will be next month. All right. Thanks so much.